Who is Truck-kun? Truck-kun is not a character as much as it is an idea, a representation of the common trope in isekai anime that begins the main character's journey into the fantasy realm. And perhaps no appearance of Truck-kun is more famous than the one found in Zombieland Saga, where the carnage is shown at multiple different angles. There's just one problem. Zombieland Saga is not an isekai, because despite it being listed as an example under Wikipedia's page for Truck-kun, which points out this is a trope specific to isekai anime, my anime list doesn't list Zombieland Saga as an isekai, because it's not one. In fact, the word isekai is commonly translated to another or different world, and even though Sakura turns into a zombie, she remains in the same world throughout the show. So, while it is a fantasy anime that involves both a time gap and a resurrection, it's not actually an isekai. This example, although not a huge issue on its own, represents a much larger problem within the anime community, lost within the debates asking questions like, what's the best isekai? And are all of the 20 isekai airing this season the exact same? Is a much more important question. What is an isekai anime? Despite the gatekeepers in my comment section claiming they know what an isekai anime is because they've been watching isekai anime since before I was born, this is a surprisingly complex and heavily contested issue. For example, is it an isekai if the main character doesn't die and isn't reincarnated? Is it an isekai if the main character can travel between the real and different worlds? And is it an isekai if it isn't in a fantasy world? While I personally think this is a weird topic to obsess over, I've seen enough fights in my comment section to know I need to speak out on this one. But before we can give a true definition to the isekai genre, I feel it's important to clear up some common misconceptions as we try to answer the most difficult question of all. Is Sword Art Online an isekai? You would think the video game anime that inspired an unfathomable number of video game isekai would be considered a video game isekai, but there are multiple nuances to SAO's plot that make defining its genre a little bit more difficult. And within 10 minutes of me creating a poll that asked my audience this exact question, we already had people fall into the first isekai misconception. No, because the main character didn't die. I'd say it's a semi-isekai. The character doesn't die, thus doesn't get transported into another world. It's a Final Fantasy game, not transported or death to other worlds. We'll deal with the idea of transportation later, because that's its whole own issue. But one thing is clear here. Many people believe the main character has to die for it to be an isekai anime. However, as I previously stated, at its core, isekai just means different or another world. And while I understand why people would have this misconception, this is objectively incorrect. The main character does not have to die for it to be an isekai anime. Rather, people are confusing this genre with isekai tensei. And much like all squares being rectangles, but not all rectangles being squares, every isekai tensei counts as an isekai, but not every isekai is required to be an isekai tensei. Mushoku Tensei? Isekai tensei. Konosuba? Isekai tensei. I Will Survive Using Potions? Not very good, but still an isekai tensei. However, one of the most popular isekai anime of all time, Re:Zero, is not an isekai tensei. Isekai tensei are the reincarnation into another world stories. These are the isekai you think of when you hear the words Truck-kun. Inherently, they involve death and reincarnation. And while Re:Zero Subaru dies plenty of times in the fantasy world, he never actually died in the real world. He kinda just spawns in the fantasy one, I think. I don't really remember. I don't like Re:Zero that much. I want to kill sister though. This is why no one takes my opinion seriously. But regardless of my stupid Re:Zero take, Re:Zero is most definitely an isekai. It just falls under isekai's second subcategory, Isekai 10e, or the transition to another world series. While some of you may think this is obvious and you know where I'm going with this, you don't, because the Isekai 10e are where things really start to get complicated. Because what exactly defines a transition to another world? Is Sword Art Online an Isekai because the players are transported to Aincrad? Or does it not count because it takes place in the virtual world? In Sasaki and Peeps, the main character is given the ability to travel between the real world and the fantasy world, and he spends nearly equal equal time in both. So is that still an isekai? Well, given that this term is a bit more ambiguous than tensei, I think it's important to find a credible source to define this one. While it seems like no one place should have the right to define a genre, every single isekai I've talked about so far has been published on one single site, Shosetsuka ni Naro, or Let's Become a Novelist, a self-publishing website that allows you to post your light novels for free for anyone to read. That, unsurprisingly, is also one of the best places to have your light novels noticed and adapted into manga and anime. So, if any company has the right to define an isekai, it's gonna be the one that brought us the peak fiction that is My One-Hit Kill Sister, and yeah, sure, also all of these other ones. But lucky for us, this website also has strict guidelines as to what can be defined as an isekai. Within this platform, an isekai tensei is defined as a work in which the main character dies in his original world and is reincarnated as a different person in a different world. Simple enough. However, an isekai 10e, on the other hand, has a much broader definition. An isekai 10e is a work in which the main character travels to a different world in some way. Transportation, summoning, possession, etc. Notice that a lot of these self-imposed rules by isekai gatekeepers aren't actually present here. For one, it doesn't clarify that this is a permanent transition. While most of the popular isekai spend a significant amount of time in the new world, having it be the only setting is not a permanent requirement. Sasaki and Peeps spends a significant amount of its time in both the real and fantasy world, with the main character having to balance his life between the two worlds. And it's defined as an isekai on my anime list because it is one. Let's Become a Novelist specifically outlines that the isekai tag is required when the main character moves between another world and the real world on a daily basis, and the story is set in both another world and the real world. A supernatural bird gives him the ability to travel between worlds. They spend many of their days traveling between the two. Therefore, it is an isekai. So does that mean that Inuyasha, a classic anime where the main character spends a significant amount of time in a fantasy land, is one of the first isekai? While many credit Inuyasha as being the OG isekai, I would argue that it's not one. And for two reasons this time. For one, this is not a travel between worlds, but a travel through time to feudal Japan, where apparently demons were commonplace, and pure time travel stories don't count as isekai. However, even if these demons existed within a spiritual world, this series still isn't an isekai, as, according to Let's Be a Novelist, reincarnation or transfer to the spirit world, according to existing myths and religion, do not need to be classified as an isekai. Because it is clearly established that these characters exist within the realms of the universe's existing religion, they would be historically and culturally related to the real world. So, unless you want to argue that, despite Kagame's transfer directly involving their family shrine, this is not a religious transportation, nor is the version of Japan they go to their real world. It's not an isekai. But at this point, I am starting to get to a level of detail that you would not need unless you were trying to write an isekai series. So, instead, let's move on to our penultimate question. Is every modern isekai the same? Just like every other question I've posed so far, it's kind of complicated. There's a general sentiment that a lot of isekai anime follow the same exact formula. A down-on-their-luck otaku is killed when they're suddenly given a second chance to live a heroic life in a fantasy world. You've heard it a million times, it's been done a billion times, but almost none of it is required for it to be an isekai. The main character doesn't have to be an otaku, they don't have to die, they don't have to become a hero, and they don't even need to go to a fantasy world. The website specifically clarifies that even if the culture is similar to modern times, the isekai tag still needs to be used if it falls under the definition of another world. But I will admit that realistically, a lot of isekai still follow the usual hero fantasy route. So why do so many isekai follow the same blueprint? Well, they're tropes for a reason. There are people that love this type of series, and I don't think it's hard to see why. By starting an isekai with a human from Earth, people are able to insert themselves into the narrative. They feel like relatable protagonists because so many isekai characters start off as losers that play video games and eat cup noodles all day. You know, the exact same thing that you do. So, when the character is suddenly given supernatural abilities, you feel as if that sad, pathetic person could have been you. They're called fantasy anime for a reason, after all. And while I understand that it can be frustrating to see how many of the same isekai are made every single season, and oh my god, are there so many isekai coming out next season, it's important to realize that they do have a pretty large audience. But with there being more than 30 anime releasing every season now, these isekai aren't even taking the spots of other series. At the end of the day, we're always going to get a few isekai that copy this series that came before them, with no series being replicated quite as much as Sword Art Online. What? You thought I forgot about that? We're coming full circle now. While SAO is easy to clown on for, you know, its plot, characters, setting, basically everything about it, it's important to realize that this series inspired nearly every video game isekai you see today. And while it's a common trope now, it was a phenomenon when it first released thanks to the potential the idea had. Trapping players in a VR MMO game was a fascinating topic. It was an absolute nightmare for some, but a fantasy for others. But is Sword Art Online technically an isekai? One of the main arguments stems from the way players are transported into the game, as players use a technology known as the Nerve Gear, which, as the name implies, is a neurological device. Well, kind of. It uses microwave transceivers to trick your brain into thinking that you're in the game. It also blocks other sensors within the brain, stopping the player from moving, and ultimately trapping them in the online world. Most other video game isekai use death or magic or some other form of transportation, making the transition to the fantasy world a bit more clear-cut. But with SAO, the line's a lot more muddied. The player's physical bodies are still on Earth, and they need to be fed nutrients to survive. Many of SAO's players died simply because they lived alone, or they didn't have family members that could afford their hospitalization. So, if it's a virtual world and the player's bodies are still on Earth, does it still count as an isekai? As previously established, an isekai teni is a work in which the main character travels to a different world in some way. I think you could argue that the Nerve Gear is some form of transportation, but what's more important is how we define the different world. Here, it means a world that is different from the real world and has nothing to do with it. It refers to a world where there are no physical connections and no means of transportation has been established. Originally, I was going to argue that this completely invalidates SAO as an isekai, as Aincrad could have a connection to the real world, and the Nerve Gear could be considered a means of established transportation. However, I did a bit more research, and as it turns out, Let's Become a Novelist outlines 2 examples that completely ends this argument. According to them, an isekai tag is required in all works where there is a reincarnation or transfer to the game world. Because there is no physical connection to the real world and no means of transportation has been established, the game world is treated as a different world. And I know some of you are going to argue that they weren't talking about VR MMOs here, but if that first example wasn't enough to convince you, they provide a second example that makes things even more clear, because the isekai tag is still required for stories where the main character's body is in the real world, but his consciousness is in the other world. So the fact that their bodies are in the real world is irrelevant. What matters is that their consciousness was, in a way, transferred to Aincrad. So, according to the website that houses all of the most popular isekai, Sword Art Online is in fact an isekai. But am I wrong in this interpretation? Is the Nerve Gear still a means of transportation? Does the Nerve Gear not actually transport people? Is Let's Become a Novelist wrong? Tell me why I'm an idiot in the comments below, and I'll be sure to not respond unless you wholeheartedly agree with me. Subscribe if you somehow enjoyed this mess of a video, and I will see you in the next one. So maybe watch one of wherever they are.